people who look like Kathleen Sebelius, and gentlemen. The purpose of No Reference Rants' video on Cliven Bundy is to paint him as a welfare recipient. So you conservatives and libertarians who defend him, you are legitimizing the massive American welfare state, like it or not. If you defend him, the American welfare state somehow becomes part of the Constitution's General Welfare Clause now. I'm not going to say much about the standoff itself, and make sure you check the links under this vid. Unlike No Reference Rants, I always source my material. I'm not going to say much about the standoff itself, except that I think Washington owning 28% of these United States, most of these states out west, in this country's infancy, Washington didn't make it a goal to acquire large swaths of land. Washington's ownership of 28% of the United States and much of the West should cease. No Reference Rants defends this authoritarian government's actions because that's their land, but doesn't defend the American taxpayer's right to the fruits of his own labor. He loves these bankrupt entitlement programs like Medicare, which he'll probably get a lot more out of than he contributed. The pukes he voted for in the 1960s enacted all these programs, which take my money by force to fund an extravagant welfare state and entitlement state. Enough about that. Let's go to the main event. If Mr. Bundy is indeed a welfare recipient, then he's outnumbered. Let's look at some figures starting with Medicaid. Medicaid's unduplicated annual enrollment in millions has increased by more than 59% from fiscal years 2000 through 2011. And again, I have references underneath the video. You can check this out. That's something people learn when they're 14. Unless they didn't go to school or went to a really bad public school. Medicaid's inflation-adjusted spending totals have seen a similar stratospheric increase, increasing by more than 1,600% since 1970, when it was in its infancy, and by more than 42% since fiscal year 2002 alone. Again, that's adjusting for inflation, little fella. I'm not sure you know what that means, but you'll have to look it up. Mr. Bundy is sorely outnumbered, tens of millions against one. Let's move on to food stamp enrollment, where Mr. Bundy is also outnumbered. Since 2002, when George W. Bush signed the Farm Bill, which made it much easier to get on food stamps, those rolls have increased by more than 145% and have been increasing every single year, whether the economy is good or not, save one. Since fiscal year 2010, food stamp enrollment has increased by more than 18%, folks. But don't forget, we're in the midst of the greatest economic recovery ever. Now we're going to take a look at the growth of the disability rolls, where I will be accused of being a heartless libertarian, probably a racist, and whatever else the troglodytes can throw in here to make themselves feel good while complaining about ranchers in Nevada who are on the public dole. If you've watched my previous videos, this will not be review for you. If you're an uneducated troglodyte with 24 hours of free time who copies all their news from Media Matters and Think Progress, this will not be review for you. The number of disabled workers, as you can see, increased rapidly in the 1970s, declined for most of the 1980s, then began a marked upwards trajectory in the 1990s that has continued to today. As you'll see when we go over the data, including just disabled workers, you'll see a massive increase. The number of just disabled workers was under 1.5 million in 1970. By 1980, that increased to well over 2.8 million disabled workers. 6 years later, the total was actually lower. As we'll soon see, that was an anomaly. By 1990, it was over 3 million. 6 years later, it was almost 4.4 million. By 2002, that total, just disabled workers alone, had spiked to well over 5.5 million. Not much later, in 2008, that total was now 7.427 million people classified as a disabled worker. By fiscal year 2013, the total was just short of 9 million. So Mr. Bundy is outnumbered 9 million to 1. Not good odds, old fella. Since this part of our Social Security became a reality in the 1950s under Eisenhower and his Democrat Congress, it was relatively benign until the 1970s. In the 1970s, this part of Social Security was completely federalized and the floodgates were opened. What am I talking about? Let's look at some demographics which I've covered in previous videos. You'll see that the majority of those who are classified as a disabled worker have some sort of mood disorder or other, differentiating between that and mental retardation, for example. Another categorization is musculoskeletal anomalies. I realize there are a lot of progressives out there who aren't capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, but that doesn't mean they're entitled to decades of benefits at my expense until they reach the age government determines you're allowed to retire. From 1996 to 2011, those with an other mental disorder and those with musculoskeletal issues have more than doubled. The percentage of those with that disability has also been on an upwards trajectory, increasing from 46.2% to a whopping 57% today. As you can see, it's becoming much easier to get on disability, and many of those folks are under 50 years of age, which means they'll be collecting benefits for at least 15 years prior to retiring and receiving good old regular Social Security, which is bleeding red ink. Again, all the links to the material underneath the video. Unlike No Reference Rants, I provide my references. Mr. Bundy is sorely outnumbered, folks. Now let's shift gears to our last piece of business, another government venture that has experienced a lot of bumps in the road, public housing. I attempted to track down data on the number of folks living in public housing and number of units classified as public housing. There are other forms of this, as you'll see, such as vouchers handed out by Washington for housing expenses. No Reference Rants will support vouchers like that, but he wouldn't support vouchers for poor children to attend private schools, for example. Let's dig into the data. Our first piece of data comes from a HUD periodical from the spring of 1995. At that point, there were approximately 1.3 million units of occupied public housing in these United States, managed by some 3,400 public housing authorities. 40% of public housing units are occupied by households headed at that time, headed by a person aged 65 years or older. I guess Social Security isn't paying them enough, is it? Despite the fact that throughout the 1980s, it was giving the average recipient $2.12 for every dollar they contributed. Households with children were 43% of public housing, and 56% of those are single-parent families. Another social problem with vast economic consequences, as I've touched on in several videos prior. Somehow this explosion of single-parent households is my problem too. In fact, it's probably my fault. Here's another politically incorrect factoid that will cause progressives to grind their teeth and yell racist. Public housing serves black households at a rate substantially greater than their share of the renter population or their proportion of the population en masse. 48% of public housing households were black in 1995, compared to only 19% of renter households. When your culture becomes a culture of single motherhood and single parent households, good things aren't going to happen. Bill Cosby and Juan Williams will point this out, and they're certainly not libertarian or conservative. Guys like Walter E. Williams and Thomas Sowell will point this out as well. They're much closer to libertarianism than the previous two. Guys like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton will find a way to blame someone else for the black community's issues. Non-Hispanic white households comprise a much smaller percentage of public housing occupation than their percentage of the population en masse or their share of the renter population. Among the heads of public housing households, 58% did not complete a high school education, which is much, much higher than the percentage of all renter households who did not finish high school. That's an important point as well. If you fail to finish high school and procreate with a baby daddy who is more of a rap wannabe than a father, then you are setting yourself up for failure. But in this day and age, it's not kosher to point that out because you might hurt someone's feelings. Let's move on to another time frame, 2009. Among the links below is plenty of reading on this issue if you want to educate yourself further. So when a guy like Old Fart Rants pulls up some unreferenced axioms he copied off of Think Progress, you'll be able to thwart his cut and paste diatribes. In calendar year 2009, there were over 1.1 million units of public housing in these United States, not counting Puerto Rico. 13.4% of public housing units are in New York City alone. In 1995, 40% of public housing occupancy were classified as seniors. In calendar year 2009, it had fallen to under 37%. Moving on to April 2014, there were 1.15 million public housing units in these United States. 45% of those residents were Black/African American. 62% of public housing occupants are 18 years of age or older. 54% of public housing occupants are 2 or more people. I believe the average was 2.2 in April 2014. 49% of public housing occupants stay in public housing for 5 years or more, so this isn't a short-term stay. As for federal spending classified as housing assistance, adjusted for inflation, has spiked since the 1960s massively. The evil George W. Bush and his spendthrift Congress spent a lot more on that than Bill Clinton and his Congress. Just in the last 6 fiscal years, we've spent $255 billion on public housing. That's just federal expenditures. I'm sure New York City spends a pretty penny on it at the city level as well. The federal government also continues to spend money on community and regional development, although it's been reined in a bit over the past few years. I'm trying to find out where that is among Congress's enumerated powers, though. Mr. Bundy is again sorely outnumbered, so I don't think it's a good idea for No Reference Rants to use the welfare line on Mr. Bundy, as that's a double-edged sword, little man. Be careful when handling it. Again, Old Fart Rants has been completely debunked, and I even provide my references too. Have a nice day.